Senator Keeffe, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Buckley, can I ask you specifically, on page 8 of your statement, you say there were periodic requests from the Central Bank financial regulator, usually addressed to the Chair of the AIB, raising concerns about and asking for reports on the mortgage market and AIB's lending strategy in relation to it. Yes. Can you tell us what sort of concerns that were being raised at that point? And specifically the concerns that they were raising.
Okay. I can remember during my time a couple of pieces of work that the regulator had asked us to do on mortgages, and essentially the concerns that the regulator was raising was, were we happy that the level of risk we were taking on in the mortgage market was appropriate? Now, could I give you a little bit of background? Well, I know you don't have much time.
I don't.
Well,
I just specifically want to know what the concerns were, Mr. Buckley.
The concerns were generalised concerns about the mortgage market, where LTVs in particular are going loan-to-value ratios, and our response. We would have been a bank who was dragged up the curve by the market in terms of LTVs, because the pace was set by Bank of Scotland, by Ulster Bank, other banks like that. And I remember very clearly that our reports back to the regulator would say, yes, we do give some 90% mortgages or whatever number we would have been using, but we are very careful that our policies in relation to giving those sort of mortgages confine them to either to applicants who are in a special place by virtue of their jobs and their career prospects, let's say people in certain professions, and second of all, people who are getting significant support from family sources to, in a sense, supplement deposits and things like that, or supplement their repayment capacity.
Was the financial regulator concerned about anything that AIB was doing?
Not specifically. These would have been all sort of industry-wide requests that would have been put out, and we would have been responding in terms of our business model.
Thank you. Mr Sheehy, when Mr Ford was here with us last week, he said that there were meetings going on all over August and September, that there was rising concern in the bank, there were management meetings at the weekend and so on. So he said, I asked, was there a very clear understanding that things were getting very serious? Yes. For everybody, including yourselves? Yes. And that it could be fatal? Yes. That's fair enough to say. What would you say to that remark that Mr Ford made as a colleague of yours?
Well, it's absolutely accurate. If the system is moving towards a condition where there is no liquidity, it is absolutely fatal for everybody.
In that situation, the bank went ahead, as discussed earlier, and paid the dividend because it had been agreed, I think you told us, in July?
Contractually obligated from July onwards.
So there was you yourselves were in a declining situation at that time. You were having meetings. You were concerned about the fate of the bank. But you still had to go ahead and pay the dividend. Have I understood that correctly?
You're mixing two things. You're talking about solvency, and I'm talking about liquidity. The liquidity issue is what was of concern. But if you'd had no liquidity, absolutely no liquidity, you would become insolvent.
Yes, and so that brings us back, I suppose, perhaps to the remark that is attributed to you that night about the bankruptcy remark that you've discussed earlier. Is it possible that in that context you may have been arguing that, well, if we are illiquid, we will be insolvent?
No, that's not what I said. We were solvent. The system in general and globally was entering into a condition it had never been in before. We had to do something about it. That's what we said to the government. But it wasn't, we had no concerns. No concerns.
No concerns
about solvency.
Okay. Why did Bank of Ireland and AIB ask to meet government rather than government ask to meet you? Or again, have we understood that correctly from the contemporaneous note that you guys made the request?
We made a request, yeah.
Why did you make the request?
Because the 29th of September was the most tumultuous day in the history of international financial services, and we were part of it.
Had the government made any indication that day or the previous day that they wanted to talk to you?
I think I was talking to officials every day, probably continuously for 30 days before that. I mean, there was a daily dialogue. There was a daily update on liquidity to the central bank. it would be wrong to say it was an event and then a break. It was a continuous contact and dialogue.
So, forgive me, I want to go back and clarify the matter about what you actually brought to that meeting, because both the contemporaneous notes, yourselves and Mr Gleeson, you say we had drawn up an alternative form, and he refers to, he said, you know, that the government, we had an extensive formula which was eventually adopted later in the night pretty well word for word. They were your contemporaneous notes in 2008, both of you. In 2015, both of you now are arguing that it was a piece of paper, in Mr Gleeson's case torn out of a notebook, in your case I think you said this morning a slip of paper. So I am confused. I believe other people may also be confused. So if you could clarify your contemporaneous note versus your recollection now.
I don't think I say in my contemporaneous note that I brought a form.
You say we had drawn up an alternative form on page 3 of your contemporaneous.
And that may have happened in the anteroom that we were in. The honest answer, I cannot remember the piece of paper. We were certainly in dialogue with the government about technical issues of what should be in, what shouldn't be in. We could have written it out. I have no piece of paper as a record of the night other than my note. If we wrote something down, we might have handed it over, but it certainly would have been a very informal piece of writing. If it happened, and I'm not going to try to read into the record something that I'm not sure of. I just don't remember it. What
was it you wanted to see government about then? Why did you want to go? If it wasn't with something in your hand and you say it wasn't, then what did you go to do?
Well, we felt that on the day, the 29th, with everything that happened globally, that we needed to see the government because we were looking at what could happen if you did nothing. That's the problem. What would happen if you did nothing? The government had already brought out a guarantee on the 20th, which was quite a substantial increase on the previous one. We had adequate liquidity, and when we say that we have enough liquidity till the end of October or 5 or 6 weeks, that assumes that you never get another cent. That's a kind of a, if you keep on funding, that keeps on moving out. But you have to take a point in time. The point in time situation was that if the markets froze totally, and there was no reason for an observer looking at the 29th of September to say, I know what's going to happen tomorrow, because nobody knew what was going to happen tomorrow. Okay. So we felt we had to go to the government and say, look, this is what we see out there. We know something needs to be done to stabilise the situation.
You've all remarked, pretty much everyone that's come here before us, that you were all very surprised at the fact that all the banks were included. When you heard all the banks were included on the following morning, did you call anybody? Did you ring the Department of Finance? Did you have any, my God, what's happened? Why did you do that? We left thinking it was 4 and now it's 6. Or did you just sit down and go, well, there we are?
The government had made a decision. We weren't going to start coming out and criticising it with the focus that was on the country at the time.
Sorry, with due respect, Mr. Sheehy, I didn't ask you to come if you came out. I asked you if you were on the phone to anybody asking why, what had happened, what had changed.
The only calls I remember making the next day were about pricing issues in London, which were quite problematic in relation to deposits. We had a big retail deposit base in London. They were the only calls I made.
So you'd argued to have the other 2 banks excluded, but when they were included, you just got on with it? We
had no choice.
Can I ask you whether you personally ever invested in property?
Never.
Okay. Were you ever in the Galway tent?
I was in the Galway races, I think, in 1969, but I was young at the time.
You were. Did you ever have hospitality with property developers?
No. I met, I think, 2 developers in the space of my tenure. One was just a courtesy call to a meeting, somebody who I dealt with when I was a branch manager 20 years before, and the other one was a serious meeting of a developer who owed us a lot of money, and I wanted to make the point with the team that things were serious and he would have to...
Finally, Mr. Sheehy, this morning you apologised, Mr. Buckley expressed regret, and yet listening to some of the remarks today, I'm still not clear what you're apologising for.
Well, I'm very clear. We took too much risk in a sector that turned out to be toxic. I was CEO. I could have stopped it. That's what I'm apologising for.
You could have stopped it?
In theory, yes.
But you didn't?
Correct.